Welcome to the virtual Ubar Center. We are still doing programs, given the tenor of the times, by this fashion rather than in person. Someday we hope to get back to doing them in person. We will be discussing today the results of a nationwide poll that we did, part of the Marquette Law School Poll, on issues not related to the Supreme Court. We asked two flavors of questions in these rounds, one on the Supreme Court, which we've already released, and one on nationwide issues, largely political. And I should say I am Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here at the law school. I am temporarily the successor to Mike Goucher, who has moved into what we are labeling an emeritus type status here at the law school after 15 years of excellent and distinguished work moderating these programs. We do want to be sure to say thank you to Mike for all those years, but I'm trying to fill those shoes, at least for the moment. We are joined, of course, by Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll, since we started this in 2012. Welcome, Professor Franklin.
Good to be here. Good to see you, Alan.
And let's turn to the new results on these political issues. Some people may groan to hear this, but there's already a lot of attention being paid to the prospects for the 2024 presidential race, and we did some polling on that, again, to emphasize this is a nationwide sample and not just Wisconsin. And we asked particularly about former President Donald Trump versus current President Joe Biden, but also one of the primary people being discussed as another Republican possibility as a nominee, Florida Governor Ron Desantis. What did we find in polling about these people?
Right. First of all, we were in the field on January 10th through the 21st of this year. We interviewed 1,000 people, and the margin of error is plus or minus 4%. We were already in the field before a lot of the political punditry and chatter about DeSantis and Trump started. And I want to put this in the context that we're not asking this question in any way to think about what the predicted outcome of the horse race will be 3 years from now. Our real purpose here is to explore how the Republican Party is thinking about alternatives to President Trump and whether President Trump may run again. But a lot of that has focused simply on the primary, and President Trump remains very strongly supported by Republican voters, as we'll see in a few minutes. But we also thought it was interesting to look at it from the broader picture of how competitive is a different Republican candidate in a national presidential race compared to how competitive President Trump would be in that race. So we paired both of them against President Biden. And in a head-to-head matchup, Florida Governor DeSantis was supported by 33% of adults, Biden by 41%, so about an 8-point Biden margin there. But a substantial 18% said they would prefer someone else, and another 8% said they wouldn't vote. And so in that, I think you're seeing both the fact that people haven't thought about the race, but also the public is grumpy by a whole lot of measures. And I think this wishing for someone else is also a sign of that grumpiness. And it's kind of nonpartisan wishing for someone else. Now, when we compared former President Trump with President Biden, Trump also was supported by 33%, and Biden's support was slightly higher, 43%, a 10-point margin. And again, 16% wanted someone else and 6% said they wouldn't vote. So I think the takeaway from that is that when it comes to a general election, in this case, DeSantis is an example that other Republicans can run at least as well against President Biden as President Trump would do against Biden. And that's a more classical way to think about competitiveness in parties is how does the general election look with this candidate or that candidate, rather than simply looking at who has the most support within the party. At this point, it's pretty clear that President Trump has the most support, but we'll see more about that in just a minute.
On the direct question of whether people want former President Trump to run again, what did we find?
Yeah, 63% of Republicans would like Trump to run in 24. 37% would not. And so that's the example of the strong support that Trump retains within the Republican Party, though more than a third wish he wouldn't run. Among independents who lean Republican, though, which is an important voting bloc, that drops to 51% that would like him to run, and 49% would prefer not. And finally, if we look across all adults in the survey, 29% would like Trump to seek the presidency again. 71% would not like him to do that. It's certainly no surprise that very, very few Democrats would like him to run again.
Favorable and unfavorable opinions of three people, former President Trump, Governor Desantis, and also former Vice President Mike Pence. What did we see there?
And Mike Pence, of course, has also been considered as a potential 2024 candidate, as well as DeSantis and Trump. Here, the first thing is, unsurprisingly, President Trump is far better known to voters than either DeSantis or Pence. In DeSantis's case, 44% of all respondents say they haven't heard enough about him to have an opinion. While 22% overall are favorable and 34% are unfavorable. With Trump, it's only 1% without an opinion, and 32 favorable, 67 unfavorable. And finally, with Pence, it's sort of in between. 17% say they haven't heard enough about him, and it's 28 favorable, 55 unfavorable. So part of the question is voters being familiar with DeSantis in particular, but oddly, that even includes the former vice president, Pence. And again, we see that Trump gets this strong level of favorability among Republicans by about a 3-to-1 margin. Among Republicans, it's 74 favorable to Trump, 25 unfavorable, so a 3-to-1 margin. But for DeSantis, it's 52-to-11, but with that 38% of Republicans that don't have an opinion. So you can look at this two ways. The favorability for DeSantis is not as high as Trump, but on the other hand, the ratio of favorable to unfavorable with Republicans is 5-to-1 versus Trump's 3-to-1. So, you know, what happens as Republican voters become more aware of DeSantis as an alternative? And likewise with Mike Pence, more Republicans don't have an opinion, 10%, but it's pretty favorable for him among Republicans, 59 favorable, 31 unfavorable. So not as strong a ratio as Trump, more like a 2-to-1 ratio among Republicans versus Trump's 3-to-1, but DeSantis at 5-to-1 of Republicans with a view of each of them.
The aftermath of the 2020 election continues. And we asked people whether they thought the outcome as it was officially counted was accurate.
Here, there is such a sharp divide across the public as a whole and looking within party. So among Republicans, nearly 3/4, 73% say they're not confident in the election accuracy, 27% are. And that's almost the same among independents who lean to the Republican Party. 71% of them are not confident. So you have a Republican Party that is really substantially doubtful about the election. But when you get to pure independents who don't lean to either party, it's 60% who are confident, 39 not confident. And among Democrats, Democratic independents that lean Democratic, 95% confident. Pure Democrats, 98% confident. So overall, we get something around 60% or a little higher that are confident in the outcome. But these very sharp partisan divides means that the Republican Party continues to debate the election outcome. We're seeing that across many states where Republicans are looking still at auditing the election or investigating the election. And that is very much the majority opinion within the party, but it's not the majority opinion across the public as a whole.
I guess it's not surprising that the more people were inclined to think the outcome of the election was not reported accurately, the more they were inclined to support Donald Trump in 2024.
That is absolutely true. But looking at it within only Republicans and independents who lean Republican. So we're just looking at it within the party. Of Republicans that are not confident in the election, 88% are favorable to Trump, just 11% unfavorable. But about a third of Republicans are not confident in the election. And there, 29% of those Republicans are favorable to Trump and 69 unfavorable to Trump. So it's a minority opinion, as I said, about 30% of all Republican and Republican leaners that are confident in the election. But you can see even within the party a real difference in opinion about Donald Trump, depending on whether you agree with him in his election claims or whether you disagree with him even while remaining a Republican. What's surprising is that with Mike Pence, who's also been caught up in the arguments about the election, there is no effect whatsoever among Republicans. 54% of those Republicans confident in the election are favorable to Pence, 33 unfavorable. But among those with doubts about the election, it's 55% favorable, 32 unfavorable. So even though there's been a lot of Republican debate about the role Pence played in certifying the election in January 6th, confidence in the election outcome really doesn't differentiate in how people feel about Pence at all, though it strongly does for Trump. And finally, when we move to Desantis, who again, I remind you, is not nearly as well known, there is again a difference. Those not confident in the election have a 62% favorability to Trump, to DeSantis. And of those Republicans that are confident, that drops to just 25% favorable, 27 unfavorable, and almost half, 48% of confident Republicans about the election don't have an opinion of DeSantis. So he seems more like Trump in the way views of him line up with views of the election, whereas Mike Pence, his views of him really do seem to be independent of how you think the election was accurate or not accurate.
We asked in this new round of polling about people's approval or disapproval of how President Biden is handling his job, and we found
the same decline in approval over time that all pollsters have found since the summer. In our July poll, he was at 58% approval, 42 disapproval. Now he's at 46 approve, 53 disapprove, a big drop of 12 points on approval. But that decline is important within party as well. Republicans have bounced around, giving him below a 20% and sometimes below a 10% approval, but haven't really trended. They've been pretty negative on Biden all along. But independents' approval has fallen 15 points from July till January, from 57 to 42. But Democrats have fallen 13 points in approval, from 96 to 83. 83 is still an absolutely high level, but falling off almost as much as independents fell is a big part of the reason why Biden's overall approval has come down as much as it has, because it's coming down across independents and especially Democrats, who might normally be expected to hold certainly more positive views than Republicans. But Democrats, you might have thought, would have remained a little more stable, but have actually become rather grumpy about the president.
There were interesting results broken down by race, the views white people had and the views black people had of President Biden.
And here the trend is most striking among Black respondents. In July, 88% of Black people had approved of the job Biden was doing. But in September, that fell to 74. In November, it fell to 68. And this month, it fell to 57%. So a steady decline month to month to month among Black respondents in our surveys. Hispanic approval has been pretty stable, but at a modest level. 56% of Hispanic people responded that they approved of Biden in July, and it's 56% in January. And it dipped to 54 and 51 before coming back up to 56. But I think clearly there's not much of a trend there. With white respondents, the shift all came in the late summer from a 50% approval in July for white respondents that fell to 40% in September, that big drop during the Afghan withdrawal and other things. But it has stayed at 40, 41, and now 40 among white respondents to the survey. So fairly level across for Hispanics across all the surveys, but a very noticeable and big drop among Black respondents and an initial sharp drop among white respondents that's plateaued, but it's plateaued at a low level of 40% approval.
We asked about favorable or unfavorable opinions overall of 3 Democrats, President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who is considered by some as a possible candidate in 2024. What did we find?
Yeah, we obviously picked these as parallels to the questions we asked about Republicans and potential Republican candidates. And with Mike Pence, we have a vice president in both of the mixes. So it's an easy comparison to make. Biden's favorability is pretty similar to his job approval, 45% approved, 45% favorable, 51% unfavorable, just 4% can't give a rating. There are, again, big partisan differences here. Very few Republicans have a favorable view. But I think from a political point of view, Biden is only 25% favorable with independents and 65% unfavorable. So again, a critical swing group in the electorate that is going more than 2-to-1, almost 3-to-1 unfavorable to him. Democrats remain quite favorable, and among people who call themselves Democrats, it's 89% favorable, a little better than his job approval with Democrats. As other polling has shown, Vice President Kamala Harris has a lower favorability rating, 37% favorable, 49% unfavorable. And again, like Pence, a higher don't know, 14% say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion of her. It is common for vice presidents to poll a little bit below their presidents that they're serving with. So I don't think that's too surprising, but it is in line with the arguments about how Harris is performing in office and that she's facing some challenges in her image from that. We added Pete Buttigieg partly because the punditry has raised him as a possible competitor to Harris in 2024 should Biden not seek re-election. And both Harris and Buttigieg ran against President Biden in the primaries. So he's a good pairing there, and a little bit like Desantis on the Republican side. With Buttigieg, 45% of respondents say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion. Again, a little bit like DeSantis there. But it's 28 favorable, 27 unfavorable, an even split on his favorability.
Congress. We talked about the Supreme Court in a separate release, and we've talked about the president here. There's a third branch of government, as I recall from my civics lessons in 9th grade. What do people think of how Congress is doing?
And its approval ratings are going down from traditionally low levels of approval. Congress rarely enjoys a lot of approval. But even so, in July, it was 33% approve, 66 disapprove. That's fallen off to 28% approve, 71 disapprove. And over the 4 surveys we've done since July, it's simply gone down each time from 33 to 30 to 27 and up to 28, just up a tick of 1 point in this last poll. But I think the important parts here are how Congress is faring with nonpartisans, with independents, where they've slipped from a 43% approval with independents in July. That's fallen off 10 points to 33% approval. Republicans weren't exactly thrilled with Congress to begin with, but have gone down by 4 points from 22 to 18. But among Democrats, who of course control both houses of Congress, there's been a little bit of erosion from 43% in July to 47%, up to 47% after passing the infrastructure bill in the late summer. But now down to 45 in November and now 40% in January. So all in all, Congress is slipping down in approval across all partisan groups and remains at a level that is pretty low at 28%. But again, you have to adjust for the fact that Congress rarely gets high approval ratings at any time in our post-World War II history of polling.
COVID. We asked people a question that is probably an indicator of how they're handling this. And the question is, how serious do you think the current COVID picture is? What do we find?
The seriousness that people ascribe to COVID tracks really well with the rise and fall of cases and hospitalizations that we've seen over the last 6 months. In September, during the surge of cases that came in the late summer, 68% said it was a serious problem, 32 not. But in early November, when cases had subsided and before the Omicron surge hit, that fell off to 50% serious, 50% not serious. But now in the midst of Omicron, we're back up to 69% serious, 31% not serious. So these views do track pretty well with the rise and fall of cases, even as our opinions about COVID and mitigation measures and masks and vaccines remain highly polarized. People are responding to the ebb and flow of cases over time pretty well. And we don't break this out, but when you look at it state by state, respondents in states with especially high levels at some point in time also say it's more serious than people interviewed at the same time, but living in states with low levels of cases. So we are responding to the reality around us, both at the national level as the numbers I just presented, but also state to state variation matters.
And bipartisanship?
Well, it's not surprising, I think, that Republicans see it as a less serious problem. In this January survey, only 45% of Republicans say it's serious, 55 not. And again, compare that with the 69% overall who think it's serious. Independents are 64% think it's serious. But when we get to Democrats, 91% say it's serious. So there's really a very sharp partisan divide looking at the same circumstances. If we look at it month to month over this time, Republicans are always at a lower level of seriousness than independents or than Democrats, but all three groups rise and fall in their assessment of seriousness with cases. It's simply that no matter what the case numbers are, Republicans consistently see it as less serious than do independents, who in turn see it as less serious than do Democrats.
I would venture to say it's a one thing that lends itself to common sense is that people who are vaccinated across all the partisanships, I believe, regarded COVID more seriously than people who are not vaccinated. What do we have there?
That's absolutely right. But of those Republicans who see it as a serious problem, 87% of them are vaccinated. But of Republicans who think it's not a serious problem, that drops off to 55% vaccinated. And we see the same pattern across party. Among independents who think it's serious, 79% are vaccinated. Of independents not serious, it's only 45%. Even among Democrats who are much more likely to be vaccinated, those who think it's serious, 96% are vaccinated, and that falls to 89% if they think COVID is not serious. So again, partisanship, the perceived seriousness of the issue, and how that responds to real world changes is one of these really consistent findings we've seen all this year and indeed last year as well, that both party and the disease and the perceived seriousness of it, and now vaccination status, are all mixed together in pretty consistent ways that are divided by party as well as the progress of the disease itself.
So overall, what do we see here for assessing the temper of our times?
I think one takeaway would be we're pretty grumpy. If you go back to those favorability numbers, pretty much everybody is more unfavorable than favorable, regardless of their party, or they're only just a little bit more favorable than unfavorable. If we look at the seriousness of COVID, again, big majority see it as a serious issue right now. But we also see the sharp partisan divides, and those are both partisan divides on political issues. Who might you vote for in an election, and favorability to candidates of your party? But we also see that partisan divide on matters of pretty important health issues like COVID and vaccination status. Finally, to come back to the issues of what's going on in the Republican Party, President Trump remains a very popular figure in the party, has convinced nearly 3/4 of Republicans to doubt the election outcome. And yet a somewhat smaller percentage, just about 60% of Republicans would like him to run, which is lower than his favorability ratings among Republicans. And then what we started with, if you think about competitiveness in national elections, we've only tested Desantis and Trump. In the future, we'll look at other potential Republican candidates. But I think the takeaway there is an alternative to Trump as a Republican candidate runs at least as well against Biden as does Trump himself. And so as we go through the next 3 years, as both parties start to sort out who's going to be their candidate in 2024, it's important to keep track of how people are shifting in their views, not only of former President Trump, but also of the alternatives to him. And the question of what does that look like as a matchup for 2024, and who might best win in 2024 against Joe Biden, as we ask today, or in the future as we ask other pairings against other Democratic candidates.
A great thank you to Professor Charles Franklin for leading us through another round of the Marquette Law School poll. We will certainly continue polling both on a national basis and focused on Wisconsin, so stay tuned for future results. All the results of this poll are posted at law.marquette.edu/poll. And we appreciate everybody listening in, and we hope we've been able to shed some light for you on the state of American public opinion.
Thank you, Alan.